Chapter 1. The ordinary day. George Hargrove's life had settled into a comfortable rhythm in the years since his retirement. At 75, he had carved out a simple, peaceful existence for himself in New York City, a place he had called home for most of his life. The city, with all its noise and chaos, had a rhythm that George found comforting, even as it constantly evolved around him. Every morning, George awoke at dawn, the soft light filtering through the curtains of his apartment on the Upper West Side. His apartment was modest but filled with the treasures of a lifetime, a vast collection of books, carefully chosen art pieces, and the meth morning routine was sacred to George. He would brew a pot of strong coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen, and then settle into his favorite armchair by the window to read the newspaper. The New York Times was his paper of choice, and he would read it cover to cover, savoring the ritual as much as the information it provided. This time alone, with his thoughts and his coffee, was a quiet meditation before the day truly began. After finishing his coffee, George would prepare for his daily walk. He dressed carefully, even though he was only going out for a stroll. A light jacket, a flat cap, and his well-worn shoes were all part of the ensemble. He took pride in his appearance, a habit instilled in him by his father, who had always believed that a man should present himself with dignity, no matter the occasion. The walk itself was a journey through time. George had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, and every corner, every building held a memory. He would pass by the old bookstore where he had spent countless hours browsing through rare first editions, the cafe where he and Eleanor had their first date, and the small park where he used to take his daughter, Emily, to play when she was little. Each of these places was like a chapter in the story of his life. On this particular day, George's walk took him down 42nd Street, a route he often took when he was meeting his old friend, Henry Myers. Henry and George had been colleagues at Columbia University, where they had both taught history for decades. Their weekly coffee meetings were a tradition that had persisted long after they had both retired. They would sit in a small cafe on the corner of 42nd and Madison, discussing everything from current events to the latest books they had read, reminiscing about the good old days when they were still shaping young minds. As George walked, he reflected on how much the city had changed. The skyline was now dominated by glass and steel towers, dwarfing the older buildings that had once been the pride of the city. The old, family-owned shops were mostly gone, replaced by luxury boutiques and chain stores. But despite these changes, George still loved the city with all his heart. It was his home, and he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. As he approached the cafe, George noticed something unusual. A crowd had gathered on the corner, their voices raised in alarm. Curious, George quickened his pace, his cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. He could see the flashing lights of a police car and the unmistakable uniforms of officers as he got closer. The scene before him was chaotic, and he felt a knot of unease form in his stomach. In the center of the commotion, two police officers were grappling with an older man, trying to force him to the ground. The man was clearly in distress, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was shouting something, but his words were lost in the cacophony of the crowd. George's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Step back, sir," one of the officers shouted at George as he approached. But George wasn't about to back down. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, and something about this situation didn't feel right at all. "What's going on here?" George demanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. He looked at the man on the ground, who was now being handcuffed. There was something in the man's eyes that struck a chord deep within George, a look of desperation and fear that he couldn't ignore. "He's under arrest for attempted theft," the officer replied curtly. "Now, move along, sir, before you get yourself into trouble." The man on the ground shook his head frantically, trying to speak. "I didn't steal anything. I swear, I was just trying to get my money. Please, help me." George's instincts told him that this was no ordinary thief. There was something more to the story, something that the officers weren't seeing. He knelt down beside the man, ignoring the protests of the police. "Don't worry," George said softly to the man, trying to calm him. "I'll help you. Just tell me what happened." The man looked up at George, his eyes filled with tears. "They wouldn't give me my money," he whispered hoarsely. "I was just trying to withdraw my savings, but they said there was a problem with my account. I got frustrated, and then they called the police." George felt a surge of anger. This man wasn't a criminal, he was a victim. A victim of a system that had failed him, and now he was being treated like a common thief. George knew he couldn't let this stand. Before he could say anything more, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't do anything wrong. The bank refused to give him his money, and he got upset. That's all." The officer who had been speaking to George turned to the woman, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, unless you have any proof, I suggest you step back." But George wasn't about to let this go. He stood up, facing the officer squarely. "You can't arrest this man without cause," he said firmly. "If what this woman says is true, then he hasn't committed any crime. You need to investigate this properly before you do anything else." The officer hesitated, clearly taken aback by George's defiance. But before he could respond, another police car pulled up, and a senior officer stepped out. He was an older man, with a stern expression and a commanding presence. The crowd parted as he approached, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" the senior officer demanded, his voice calm but authoritative. The younger officer quickly explained the situation, but the senior officer's gaze remained fixed on George. "And who are you?" he asked. George met the officer's gaze without flinching. "My name is George Hargrove," he replied. "And I'm telling you that this man is innocent. He was trying to withdraw his own money, and the bank refused him. This needs to be investigated properly." The senior officer studied George for a moment, then turned to the man on the ground. "Is that true?" he asked. The man nodded weakly. "Yes, sir. I didn't do anything wrong." The senior officer sighed, then turned to his men. "Get him up," he ordered. "We'll take him to the station and sort this out." The officers helped the man to his feet, no longer using force, and escorted him to the squad car. The crowd began to disperse, some of them murmuring in approval, others still unsure of what had just happened. George watched as the man was driven away, a mixture of relief and concern washing over him. He had done what he could, but the battle was far from over. There would be investigations, hearings, and perhaps even a trial. But at least, for now, the man had a chance. As the crowd thinned, George turned and continued his walk to the cafe. His coffee with Henry would have to wait. There was something more important he needed to do. He needed to find out more about the man he had just saved, and make sure that justice was served. Chapter 2, The Unforeseen Incident. George couldn't shake the image of the man being taken away by the police as he walked into the cafe. His usual sense of calm had been replaced by a gnawing feeling of unease. He had lived through enough to know when something wasn't right, and this was one of those times. As he sat down at his usual table, he barely noticed when Henry Myers, his old friend, arrived and took the seat across from him. "George?" Henry's voice broke through his thoughts. "You seem a bit off today. What's on your mind?" George looked up, meeting Henry's concerned gaze. Henry was a fellow history professor who had retired a few years after George. The two had shared a lifelong passion for teaching, and their weekly coffee meetings had become a cherished tradition. But today, George had trouble focusing on their usual banter. "I saw something today, Henry," George began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. He recounted the incident in detail, describing the man's desperation, the harshness of the police, and the uncertainty that lingered in his mind. Henry listened intently, his brow furrowing as George spoke. When George finished, Henry took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "It sounds like a terrible situation, George. But what can we do? The system is stacked against people like him. Even if he's innocent, proving that is going to be an uphill battle." George nodded slowly, understanding Henry's point but feeling a growing determination to help. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I can't just stand by and do nothing. That man, Walter, I think his name was, he needs someone to fight for him. I'm not a lawyer, but I can be a voice. Henry sighed, a mix of admiration and concern on his face. You've always been a fighter, George, even when the odds are against you. Just be careful, all right? These kinds of things can get complicated fast. I will, George assured him, though his mind was already racing with plans. He needed to find out more about Walter, to understand the full story so he could help him in whatever way possible. After finishing his coffee, George said goodbye to Henry and set off with renewed purpose. His first stop was the local police precinct where Walter had been taken. George knew that getting information out of the police wouldn't be easy, especially since he was just an ordinary citizen with no legal authority. But George had a lifetime of experience dealing with difficult situations, and he wasn't going to let a few obstacles stand in his way. At the precinct, George approached the front desk, where a young officer looked up at him with mild disinterest. "Can I help you?" the officer asked. "Yes, I'm here to inquire about a man who was brought in earlier today." "His name is Walter Thompson," George said, keeping his tone polite but firm. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And who are you, exactly?" "I'm George Hargrove, a concerned citizen who witnessed the incident. I'd like to know what charges are being brought against Mr. Thompson and if he's been given legal representation," George replied, trying to maintain an air of authority. The officer sighed, clearly not in the mood to deal with a persistent old man. "Look, sir, I can't just give out that kind of information. If you're not his lawyer or a family member, there's not much I can tell you." George felt a flicker of frustration but kept his composure. "I understand that, but I'm not asking for privileged information. I simply want to make sure that Mr. Thompson's rights are being respected and that he's being treated fairly. Isn't that something we should all be concerned about?" The officer hesitated, clearly torn between following protocol and acknowledging the validity of George's concern. Finally, he relented, though only slightly. "All I can tell you is that Mr. Thompson is being held for questioning. If you want more information, you'll need to speak with his lawyer or wait until the investigation is complete." It wasn't much, but it was something. George thanked the officer and left the precinct, his mind already working on the next step. He needed to find out more about Walter, his background, his situation, and what might have led to this unfortunate series of events. The best place to start would be the bank where the incident had occurred. Chapter 3, The Investigation Begins. George made his way to the bank, a large, imposing building in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. The events of the morning had left him with more questions than answers, and he hoped that by retracing Walter's steps, he might gain some insight into what had really happened. As he entered the bank, George took a moment to survey his surroundings. The atmosphere was one of cold efficiency, with customers going about their business, oblivious to the turmoil that had occurred just hours earlier. He approached the counter, where a young teller greeted him with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" the teller asked. "I'm here to ask about an incident that occurred this morning involving a customer named Walter Thompson," George said, watching the teller's reaction closely. The smile faltered, and the teller's eyes darted nervously to the side. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not at liberty to discuss any incidents that happen in the bank. If you have a concern, I suggest you contact our corporate office." George leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I understand that you're following protocol, but this is important. A man's life is at stake here. I just need to know if there were any unusual circumstances that might have caused the misunderstanding." The teller bit her lip, clearly conflicted. She glanced around, as if making sure no one was watching, before leaning in closer. "Look, I can't say much, but I can tell you that Mr. Thompson was really upset. He kept saying that he needed to withdraw his money for something urgent, but there was a problem with his account. The manager got involved, and things escalated from there. That's all I can tell you." George nodded, grateful for the small piece of information. "Thank you. I appreciate your help." He left the bank with a better understanding of the situation, but there were still too many unknowns. What was the problem with Walter's account? Why was he so desperate to get his money? And why had the bank's response been so harsh? As George walked through the bustling streets of Manhattan, he knew that finding the answers to these questions would be key to helping Walter. He decided that the next step would be to visit Walter's neighborhood and see if he could learn more about the man who had unwittingly become the center of this storm. Chapter 4, Walter's World. Walter Thompson lived in a rundown apartment building on the Lower East Side, a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers of Midtown Manhattan. George had to take 2 subways and walk several blocks to reach the area, and by the time he arrived, the afternoon had given way to early evening. The neighborhood was a mix of old tenements, small businesses, and the occasional modern development, a place where the city's past and present seemed to collide. As George approached the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. This was the kind of place that had been forgotten by the city's rapid progress, where people struggled just to get by. It wasn't hard to imagine why someone like Walter might be desperate to access his savings. The building itself was a decrepit structure, with peeling paint and broken windows. George hesitated at the entrance, wondering how best to approach the situation. He didn't want to seem intrusive, but he knew that talking to Walter's neighbors might be the only way to get a fuller picture of his life. He entered the building, the smell of damp and decay assaulting his senses. The narrow hallway was dimly lit, and George could hear the distant sounds of televisions and conversations behind closed doors. He made his way to the 3rd floor, where Walter's apartment was located, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. George waited a moment, then knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. He was about to give up when he heard the creak of a door opening behind him. He turned to see an elderly woman peeking out from the apartment across the hall. "Are you looking for Walter?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. "Yes, ma'am," George replied, stepping closer. "I'm a friend of his. I was hoping to talk to him, but it seems he's not home." The woman shook her head sadly. "Walter's been having a tough time lately. Ever since his wife passed away, he hasn't been the same. Poor man's been in and out of the hospital, and I think he's been having money troubles. It's a shame, really. He's a good man." George felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm trying to help him," he said gently. "Do you know anything about the trouble he's been having with the bank?" The woman sighed, opening her door a bit wider. "He mentioned something about his account being frozen. Said he needed the money to pay for some medical bills, but they wouldn't let him have it. I don't know much more than that, but it's clear he's been struggling." George nodded, feeling the weight of Walter's situation more heavily now. "Thank you for telling me. I'll do everything I can to help him." The woman smiled faintly. "You're a good man for trying to help, Mr. Hargrove," George supplied. "George Hargrove. Well, Mr. Hargrove, I hope you can make a difference. Walter could use a friend right now." With a nod of thanks, George turned and left the building. As he stepped back out onto the street, he couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had settled in his chest. Walter was in a dire situation, and the more George learned, the more determined he became to see this through. Chapter 5, The Legal Battle. The next morning, George returned to the precinct, determined to speak with Walter. He knew that time was of the essence. If Walter was to be charged with a crime he didn't commit, his chances of a fair outcome would diminish rapidly. As he approached the front desk, the same officer from the previous day looked up, clearly surprised to see him again. "Back again, Mr. Hargrove?" the officer asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "Yes, I am," George replied firmly. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson, if that's possible." "He hasn't been formally charged yet, has he?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but he's still being held for questioning. I'm not sure if he's allowed visitors. Could you at least ask?" George pressed, unwilling to give up. With a sigh, the officer picked up the phone and made a call. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned back to George. "You can see him, but only for a few minutes. Follow me." George was led through a series of corridors to a small, windowless room where Walter was sitting, his hands resting on the metal table in front of him. He looked up as George entered, and his face brightened with recognition. "Mr. Hargrove," Walter said, his voice shaky but grateful. "I didn't expect to see you again." George sat down across from him, noting the exhaustion etched into Walter's features. "I wanted to check on you, Walter. I've been trying to understand what happened, and I spoke to one of your neighbors. She told me about the trouble you've been having with your bank account." Walter nodded wearily. "It's been a nightmare, Mr. Hargrove. I needed the money to pay for some treatments, but when I tried to withdraw it, they told me my account was flagged for suspicious activity. I've been with that bank for years, never had a problem before. But now, they're treating me like a criminal." George leaned forward, his voice filled with empathy. "I'm going to help you, Walter. We're going to get to the bottom of this. But first, we need to get you out of here. Have you been assigned a lawyer?" Walter shook his head. "No, they haven't given me one yet. I don't even know if I can afford one." George felt a surge of determination. "Don't worry about that. I'll make some calls, see if I can find someone who can represent you. In the meantime, try to stay strong. We'll get through this." Walter looked at George with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you doing this for me, Mr. Hargrove? You don't even know me." George smiled faintly. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've lived long enough to know that we have to stand up for each other, especially when the system tries to tear us down." They were interrupted by the sound of the door opening, and the officer who had escorted George in stepped inside. "Time's up," he said gruffly. George nodded and stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Walter's shoulder. "I'll be back, Walter. Just hang in there." As George left the precinct, he pulled out his phone and began dialing the number of an old friend, one who had spent his career as a defense attorney. George knew that if anyone could help Walter, it would be him. Chapter 6, Unlikely Allies. George's call to his old friend, Marcus Sullivan, was brief but productive. Marcus had been one of the top defense attorneys in New York before he retired a few years back. Known for his tenacity and his ability to navigate the complexities of the legal system, Marcus had earned a reputation as someone who could take on the most challenging cases and win. If there was anyone who could help Walter, it was Marcus. "George, it's been too long," Marcus said, his deep voice resonating through the phone. "What can I do for you, old friend?" "Marcus, I need your help," George replied, wasting no time in explaining the situation. He recounted the events of the past 2 days, detailing Walter's predicament and the urgency of the matter. There was a pause on the other end of the line as Marcus took in the information. "Sounds like a tough spot," he finally said. "But it's not impossible. I'll take the case, George. Let me make some calls, see if I can get Walter released on bail while we sort this out." George felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Marcus. I knew I could count on you." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus replied, though his tone was reassuring. "We've got a long road ahead of us, but I'll do everything I can to help your friend." With Marcus on board, George felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew the legal battle would be difficult, but with a skilled attorney like Marcus by Walter's side, they had a fighting chance. The following day, Marcus moved quickly. He filed a motion for Walter's release, arguing that the bank's actions were unjustified and that there was no evidence to support the criminal charges. To Marcus's credit, his reputation and the strength of his argument convinced the judge to grant Walter bail, and by the afternoon, Walter was free. When George met Walter outside the courthouse, he could see the relief on the man's face. Walter looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Walter said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." George shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Walter. We're in this together. Now let's go talk to Marcus and figure out our next steps." Chapter 7, Unearthing the Truth. With Walter out on bail, George, Marcus, and Walter began working tirelessly to prepare for the legal battle ahead. Marcus used his connections to gather information about the bank and its practices, hoping to uncover any irregularities that might have led to Walter's account being flagged. Meanwhile, George continued to investigate Walter's situation, speaking to more of his neighbors and even visiting the hospital where Walter had been receiving treatment. Through their efforts, they began to piece together a clearer picture of what had happened. It turned out that Walter's account had been flagged due to a series of large withdrawals he had made over the past few months, withdrawals that were necessary to cover his mounting medical expenses. The bank, seeing these transactions as unusual, had frozen his account as a precaution, but had failed to notify Walter or provide him with a clear explanation. Marcus was outraged when he learned of this. "This is a clear case of negligence," he said during one of their meetings. The bank had no right to freeze Walter's account without properly investigating the situation first. "They've caused him untold harm, and we're going to make sure they're held accountable." As they delved deeper, they also discovered that Walter's financial troubles had been compounded by a series of clerical errors made by the bank. Payments that should have gone through were delayed, leading to late fees and penalties that further drained Walter's savings. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Walter had been caught in a web of bureaucratic incompetence and mismanagement. But Marcus wasn't just focused on the bank's negligence. He also began to prepare a defense for Walter in case the charges against him weren't dropped. He gathered character witnesses from Walter's community, including the elderly woman George had spoken to earlier, who all attested to Walter's good character and the hardships he had faced. Meanwhile, George continued to support Walter in any way he could. He spent hours with Walter, listening to his concerns, offering advice, and helping him navigate the overwhelming process of preparing for a court case. George's presence was a source of comfort for Walter, who had never been through anything like this before. Chapter 8, The Case of Conscience. As the court date approached, the pressure began to mount. Marcus had done everything he could to prepare for the trial, but there were still many uncertainties. Would the judge see the case for what it was, a miscarriage of justice, or would he side with the bank, as so often happened in cases like this? The stakes were high, and everyone involved felt the weight of what was to come. George, who had always prided himself on staying calm under pressure, found himself feeling more anxious than he had in years. He had become deeply invested in Walter's case, and the thought of the man being sent to prison for something he didn't do was almost too much to bear. Yet, despite his fears, George remained resolute. He knew they had done everything they could to fight for justice, and now it was up to the court to decide. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Walter sat at the defense table, flanked by Marcus and George, who had been granted permission to sit with them as a show of support. The prosecution, representing the bank's interests, presented their case first, arguing that the bank had acted within its rights to freeze Walter's account and that his subsequent actions had warranted the involvement of law enforcement. When it was Marcus's turn, he delivered a powerful defense. He laid out the bank's numerous failures and the devastating impact they had had on Walter's life. He called witnesses who testified to Walter's character, and he presented evidence showing that the bank had acted negligently and without proper cause. Marcus's argument was clear and compelling, and it was obvious that the judge was paying close attention. As the trial came to a close, the judge called for a brief recess before delivering his verdict. The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited for the judge to return. When he finally did, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The judge began by summarizing the case, acknowledging the complexity of the situation and the arguments presented by both sides. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he delivered his decision. In light of the evidence presented, it is clear that the bank acted negligently in its handling of Mr. Thompson's account. Their actions caused significant harm to Mr. Thompson, and they failed to take the necessary steps to address the situation in a timely and appropriate manner. As such, I find in favor of the defense. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before they fully registered with those in the courtroom. George felt a rush of relief wash over him as Walter's eyes filled with tears. Marcus smiled, clearly pleased with the outcome, and even the judge allowed himself a small nod of approval, but the judge wasn't finished. He continued, "Furthermore, I am ordering the bank to pay restitution to Mr. Thompson for the financial and emotional damages he has suffered as a result of their actions." This court will not tolerate such reckless behavior on the part of financial institutions, and I hope this serves as a reminder to all that justice will be served." With that, the trial was over. Walter had won, and the weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift from his shoulders. Chapter 9, A New Beginning. In the days following the trial, Walter's life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The restitution he received from the bank allowed him to pay off his medical bills and get back on his feet. But more than that, the experience had given him a new perspective on life. He had seen the worst of what the system could do, but he had also seen the best in people like George and Marcus, who had fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. As for George, the experience had been transformative as well. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, but this case had shown him just how important it was to take action, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He and Walter had become close friends, and George made a point to check in on him regularly, ensuring that he was doing well and that the bank kept its word. Marcus, too, had been affected by the case. Though he had taken on countless cases over his career, this one had reminded him why he had become a lawyer in the first place: to fight for justice, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. It had reinvigorated his passion for the law, and he had even begun to consider taking on a few more cases. Despite his retirement and the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal for all involved. Walter continued to live in his apartment on the Lower East Side, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He had started volunteering at a local community center, helping others who were struggling with financial and legal issues. He had become something of a local hero, known for his resilience and his determination to fight back against the injustices he had faced. George and Henry continued their weekly coffee meetings, but the conversations were different now. There was a sense of fulfillment in George's voice, a contentment that came from knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. And though they still discussed history and philosophy, they also talked about the importance of action, of using their knowledge and experience to make the world a better place. Chapter 10, The Legacy. The case of Walter Thompson became a turning point for many. News of the trial and its outcome spread, sparking conversations about the responsibilities of financial institutions and the rights of their customers. The bank involved in the case faced public scrutiny and was forced to make significant changes to its policies to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. For George, the experience was a reminder that even in retirement, he could still make a difference. He began to get more involved in local activism, joining organizations that fought for social and economic justice. He used his platform as a respected academic to speak out on issues that mattered, and he encouraged others to do the same. Marcus, inspired by the success of the case, returned to the courtroom, taking on pro bono cases for those who couldn't afford legal representation. He knew that the fight for justice was never truly over, and he was determined to continue the work that had defined his career. Walter, meanwhile, became a beacon of hope for his community. He continued to volunteer and eventually started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping others navigate the complexities of the financial system. He had been through the fire and emerged stronger, and he was committed to making sure others didn't have to go through the same struggles he had faced. As the years passed, the legacy of the case lived on. It was a story that was told and retold, reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail. And for George, Marcus, and Walter, it was a chapter in their lives that had brought them together, forged a deep bond, and left an indelible mark on their hearts. They had each found something in the experience, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. For George, it was the knowledge that doing the right thing was always worth the fight. For Marcus, it was the reminder that the law could be a force for good. And for Walter, it was the understanding that even when life seemed at its darkest, there was always hope. Together, they had faced a challenge that seemed impossible, and together, they had emerged victorious. Their story was one of courage, resilience, and the unyielding belief in the power of justice, a story that would inspire others for generations to come. Epilogue: The Power of Compassion. Years later, as George sat in his favorite cafe, now a little older and a little wiser, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The world had changed in many ways, but the lessons he had learned during Walter's case remained as relevant as ever. He had seen firsthand the impact that one person could have when they chose to stand up for what was right. He had witnessed the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the importance of never giving up, no matter how difficult the fight. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about Walter, now a respected figure in the community, and Marcus, who had become a mentor to a new generation of lawyers. They had all been forever changed by the experience, and they had each gone on to do great things, but it wasn't just about the big victories or the public recognition. It was about the small, everyday acts of kindness and justice that made the world a better place. It was about the quiet moments of courage, the choices made in the face of adversity, and the unwavering belief that, together, we could create a brighter future. George smiled to himself, knowing that the story of Walter Thompson was just one of many, one of countless stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And as he looked out the window at the bustling streets of New York, he knew that there were still many more stories to be written, many more battles to be fought, and many more victories to be won. And with that thought, he finished his coffee, picked up his pen, and began to write.